If you recall, last week we finished the ISLM model. And the ISLM model, from the end of the ISLM model, we got the aggregate demand curve. Right at the end of the ISLM model, we saw that if we changed prices, we could plot an inverse relationship between the price level and the level of equilibrium output in the ISLM model. So that inverse relationship then gives us the aggregate demand curve. So that will bring us to a discussion on aggregate demand and aggregate supply in chapter 28. So bringing together aggregate demand and aggregate supply, we're going to explain how real GDP and the price level are determined, and how changes in aggregate supply and changes in aggregate demand can lead to economic growth. Not only can we have economic growth, but also inflation. And bearing in mind that economic growth is not a smooth ride, it's quite bumpy, we end up with something called the business cycle. So we're going to explain the business cycle using our aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. The business cycle was something that we looked at back in the day, chapter 21, chapter 20, 21. The very first few lectures, we explained the fact that there was something called a business cycle. We're going to look at a model that explains the business cycle. And then we'll just talk about the main schools of thought behind macroeconomics. So aggregate demand, aggregate supply. The aggregate demand, aggregate supply model explains how real GDP and price level are determined and how they interact with one another. And we begin our discussion with aggregate supply. What is aggregate supply? It's the relationship between the quantity of real GDP supplied and price level. And we distinguish between two time frames, short run and long run. So what this looks like, in the long run, this is our long run aggregate supply, plotting price level against real GDP. Here's our short run aggregate supply, plotting price level against GDP. What do we notice about the relationship between the short run aggregate supply relationship? What does it tell us about the relationship between price and quantity supplied? It's upward sloping. There's a positive relationship. When the price level increases, the quantity supplied increases. So we're used to seeing something like that. Supply, we normally think of supply as being positively related to price level. Nothing new there. Okay, upward sloping supply. Our long run aggregate supply, however, is this vertical curve. What does that tell us about the relationship between the price level and the quantity supplied in the long run? Regardless of the price level, I'm always supplying the same amount. Okay, that's new. That's a little bit strange. That's not the kind of thing that we've spoken about before. We'll talk more about it. So the first thing we're going to look at is the short run. Short run aggregate supply is the relationship between the quantity of real GDP supplied and the price level. And here's the thing. When the money wage rate, one, the money wage rate, two, the prices of all the other factors of production, and three, potential GDP, all remain constant. Okay? So this short run relationship here assumes that all of these things, money wage rates, as well as prices of other factors of production, as well as potential GDP, remain constant. We will talk just now about what happens when those change. So if we have a shift in the short run aggregate supply curve, how does that come about? A change in the price level changes the quantity of GDP supplied, but it doesn't shift or doesn't change the entire aggregate supply relationship. Aggregate supply changes when an influence on production plans other than the price level changes. In other words, what happens when there's a change in the money wage rate? When the money wage rate or the price of any of those other factors of production, but the one that we're most interested in is the money wage rate. That's the one that we're going to concentrate on the most. When that changes, and if the money wage rate, for example, increases, if it goes up, the money wage rate goes up, you will have a change in the short run aggregate supply curve. It will shift to the left, but not in the long run aggregate supply curve. And there are two reasons that the money wage rate can change: departures from full employment and expectations about inflation. So we'll come back to that in a moment. So for now, basically what we're summarizing here is, if the prices of your factors of production go up, your short-run aggregate supply shifts to the left. Now that should be familiar from microeconomics as well. Remember, when your input prices go up, supply shifts to the left. Why? Because it costs more to produce, which means you need a higher price to sell or to supply the same quantity of goods to the market. So nothing special about that. What is going to be special is when we talk about why the money wage rate will adjust, and we'll talk about that just now. Okay? And that brings us to the labor market. And that's when things start getting quite exciting. Alternatively, we could have a shift in the entire long-run aggregate supply curve. And when the long-run aggregate supply curve shifts, the short-run aggregate supply curve shifts with it. Okay? So here in the blue, we've got this long-run and short-run, and at the price level of 110, they intersect. If my long-run aggregate supply curve shifts to the right, my short-run aggregate supply curve shifts with it. Okay? So the short-run aggregate supply curve is derived from the long-run aggregate supply curve. So any change in the long run must also have a change on the short-run curve. Now, why might the long-run aggregate supply curve shift? Well, the long-run aggregate supply curve, this quantity that is supplied, okay? In other words, the quantity that determines the position of the long-run aggregate supply curve is what we call potential GDP. Now, we've come across that term before. Remember, potential GDP was the GDP level that we read off our production function when we had equilibrium in our labor market. Does this all ring a bell? Okay? So we're going to do this slide and then we're going to stop, okay? Slide, then we're going to take a break. So bear with me while we do one quick set of drawings. Okay, remember when we had our labor supply, so we've got the real wage versus quantity of labor with the downward sloping labor demand, upward sloping labor supply, and equilibrium, which gives us some level of equilibrium labor. And we have output, so we have a production function plotting labor against output. If we input that same level of labor into our production function, we end up with some level of output. And we call this level of labor something special. What do we call it? That is correct. We call that full employment. And the full employment level of output gives us some level of output which we call potential GDP. So what I could do if I wanted to kind of make everyone squirm, I could plot over here output against price level, and this level Y0 would be my long run aggregate supply. Okay? Yeah? Cool. Okay, let's take a break then, and then we will do a question.